The US must halt plans to weaponize outer space, and the world should focus on important topics like food security. So say the members of BRICS in a 24-page joint declaration. Details coming up. A joint declaration by the BRICS group reveals stark differences between the attitudes of their nations and those of the United States and US-led groupings such as NATO. Number 1, power sharing. The BRICS declaration calls for greater representation of emerging markets and developing countries in international organizations. It uses the word multilateral 18 times. In contrast, both political parties in the United States take an America First position, claiming the inviolable right to global leadership for their country. Here's Obama, here's Biden, here's Kagan. Number 2, guns in space. The BRICS group calls for the signing of the Treaty on the Prevention of the Placement of Weapons in Outer Space and of the threat or use of force against outer space objects. In contrast, the US refuses to sign this treaty, saying the treaty is a trap designed to tie America's hands in space. The US wants to weaponize space under its guiding principle: more guns equals more peace, as long as it's their guns, of course. Number 3, the United Nations. Throughout this document, the group calls for the UN Charter to be respected and the organization to be allowed to do its job. In contrast, the US has a fractious relationship with the UN and its main elements. For example, the US withdrew from the UN Human Rights Council and from UNESCO, then rejoined. It periodically threatens the WHO with defunding. And some politicians, including 2024 presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy, say they're considering withdrawing the United States entirely from the United Nations. If the Republicans win the next election, the UN is set to be partially defunded or worse. Number 4, fair trade. The BRICS group calls for respect for the international rules of trade and the World Trade Organization, which oversees them. We reaffirm our support for the open, transparent, fair, predictable, inclusive, equitable, non-discriminatory and rules-based multilateral trading system with the World Trade Organization at its core. The declaration highlights the importance of ending hunger and achieving food security for humanity by playing fair according to WTO rules. Now, in contrast, the US fought endless bitter wars with the WTO during the Trump era, and then, when Biden took over, it battled the WTO even harder. Even New York Times columnist Paul Krugman said, "They're playing much harder hardball than previous administrations." Number 5, human rights. The BRICS group calls for human rights to be protected in a non-selective, non-politicized and constructive manner and without double standards. That's a really interesting one. For decades, the United States has weaponized the concept of human rights against its rivals while absolving itself of any wrongdoing, such as the huge numbers of deaths it has caused in military interventions. Number 6, unilateral actions. The BRICS group calls for a halt to countries taking unilateral actions, some of which are clearly illegal, especially against poor people. We express concern about the use of unilateral coercive measures, which are incompatible with the principles of the Charter of the UN and produce negative effects, notably in the developing world. Now, in contrast, the United States has long been addicted to taking unilateral actions against other countries, big and small, rich and poor. It backs these unilateral sanctions with secondary sanctions and sometimes military action. To take just one example, the UN okayed a temporary no-fly zone over Libya in March of 2011. Russians warned that the US would unilaterally turn this into one of their regime change operations. The US denied that they would do such a thing. No. But the Russians turned out to be right, okay? A NATO bombardment was launched that lasted literally for months until Gaddafi was overthrown. Then finished. Number 7, shared power inside the UN. Now, the BRICS group highlights the need for more democracy within the walls of the United Nations itself, calling for the legitimate aspirations of emerging and developing countries from Africa, Asia and Latin America, including Brazil, India and South Africa, to play a greater role in international affairs, in particular in the United Nations, including its Security Council. In contrast, 3 of the 5 power seats on the UN Security Council are taken up by 3 Western countries, whose members together govern less than 6% of the world. These 3 nations talk endlessly about democracy, but won't share those seats. Number 8, preparing for peace. The BRICS group calls for its member countries to focus on promoting peace building. In contrast, the US has recently travelled to numerous countries across Asia, including Australia, South Korea, Japan, Papua New Guinea, and many, many others, advising that they need to prepare for war. I wonder who that will be against. Number 9, reducing tension in the Middle East. The BRICS group wants a change of direction in West Asia, from decades of violence to the embracing of peace. We welcome the re-establishment of diplomatic relations between the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Islamic Republic of Iran, the document says, without mentioning that China brokered that deal. The declaration says the group wants to emphasize that de-escalating tensions and managing differences through dialogue and diplomacy is key to peaceful coexistence. In contrast, the US has for decades unfairly sided with Israel against all the neighbours and is now struggling to present itself as a balanced player in the region. You reap what you sow, right? And number 10, fighting terrorism. The BRICS group calls for an expeditious finalisation and adoption of the Comprehensive Convention on International Terrorism within the UN framework, and for launching multilateral negotiations on an international convention for the suppression of acts of chemical and biological terrorism. That was proposed years ago but has been blocked by the US and some other nations who object to the definition of terrorism and seek exclusions to safeguard their strategic interests. The US wants the draft to exclude peacetime acts of violence committed by state military forces. Not sure what they're planning there, but I can guess. And talking of bioweapons, the US runs biolabs in many locations around the world, and the Western media dutifully reports that these are all focused entirely on health improvement. I've never seen a mainstream media outlet asking the obvious question. If they are focused on healthcare, why aren't they managed by the health department? Why are they managed by the Pentagon? Okay, now these are some of the key differences in what is officially called the BRICS Summit Johannesburg II Declaration. For anyone who wants to check the facts, I'll provide a link to the full document. One of the problems here is that this information will not be shared by the mainstream media, so please consider sharing it with your friends. The world will thank you. Peace.